Hello, Professor. It's good to see you again. How are
Hi,
you?
Rick. Good to see you again, too.
Oh, that's wonderful. But you and I spent a little bit of time chatting before this call. And, you're originally from Iran. You immigrated here when you were 9 years old.
Mhm,
Your journey took you from, BYU to law school to
mhm,
Wall Street to lots of places that have really influenced and
mhm.
informed who you are today. And I would love for you to kind of give us a minute or two on how that journey shaped your thinking, because I think it's important to know where someone comes from to
Mhm.
understand kind of their point of view. But I also want to highlight that you are a proud mother of three, which is probably the most important part of all of this. So
Mhm. Mhm.
just give us a little bit on you so that we can get into it.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking the question. I mean, it's funny. Everything that it's hard to know what has influenced you because I don't know any other life, right? I mean, I think all of us would say yes. Of course, I can look back at my history, but I also don't know any other history. But I do think that some of the things that motivate me is, I grew up in Iran where the government took a steep downhill turn during my childhood, and a lot of rights were taken away, and a lot of just I saw a society essentially decline, and so I am very interested in the preservation of institutions and rule of law, because I saw what the extreme end of that looked like growing up, and when I moved to America as an immigrant, around 9 when we got here, and moved all over the country, and we didn't have a lot of money. My father was a physician in Iran, and here had to do his training again. And so I guess I've seen kind of financial inequality from both sides. Although I have had certain privileges in my life that I certainly others haven't, and that my parents were college educated when we got here. But it's some of the myths I heard about poverty and decision making, and the people that lived in the communities that I grew up in have felt to me like I needed to correct these myths, because it was discounting people's really hard work. And then as far as being on Wall Street, I mean, I think many of us may have had this experience, but I graduated law school in 2005, and I started working at a banking law firm in 2005, and I went in the olden days when we thought the economy was one thing into the sort of like the collapse of everything that we kind of knew in 2008, and then the recovery. And my firm was actually the biggest sort of banking law firm in Wall Street, and so I got like a firsthand seat. And I like to say that, like, working on Wall Street kind of radicalized me because it felt like all of the ways that I had kind of experienced markets and the law, I just had more of an insight into some of the flaws in the system and how they could be made better, but also that the respect for the rule of law. I mean, I really want to come back to that, because I think there is a lot in the US system of financial oversight and risk management that is good, and some that was faulty. Right. So
That's terrific.
mhm,
I want to get right into it
mhm,
on a big topic. You talk, Americans are very proud of the
mhm,
capitalism that
mhm,
exists in this country, and it's admired by
mhm,
many other countries. Yet you talk about there's a lot of myths about capitalism
mhm,
in our country.
mhm,
There's a lot of contradictions that are really not capitalistic, that in many ways have led to the uprising of some in our society, not others. So tell us about the myths in society
mhm.
today around capitalism in your mind.
Yeah. So that I think is the myth that I go at in the entire book, is this idea that, like, we live in a capitalist society and that the alternative is socialism, right? And I think the truth is actually that I don't know what happened in Russia, but that clearly wasn't good. But we also don't live in a straight capitalist system, and I think that's especially true when you look at the Black community and other communities that have been left out. So this book actually started as a project of looking at several different sort of excluded communities over the years. So Italians, Jewish immigrants, Polish immigrants, Germans, Italians, and Irish, and how they were not considered white. There was a lot of discrimination, and none of which was as much as the Black-white racial wealth gap. And so I kind of fixed on that story because I think it tells every other story. If you can kind of follow the thread of what capitalism, how markets and capitalism work when you're excluded from legal protection. So the Black community was not only their contracts weren't protected by law, their property wasn't protected by law, but also they were like vulnerable to and submitted to a lot of terrorist violence that was accounted for. There was a lot of promises that the Constitution made to the Black community that were violated immediately and over time. And the sort of justice demands from like very righteous justice demands, both at Reconstruction and in civil rights, were kind of not heeded properly, right? I think at Reconstruction, there was this very cogent demand for, look, we have been capital. You have built, an entire society on the bodies of Black men and women, and if you want us to participate, or if we are allowed to participate in capitalism, that's the way toward freedom. That we need capital, we need some access to land, and that was not given. And subsequently, the Black population was kind of entered into a debt kind of system of sharecropping, and the rights were taken away, the voting right, the right to representation and equal protection, because they didn't have land and they couldn't protect themselves through the market. And so the people who made laws made it such that you couldn't sell to Black families properties, or give them wages by contract, which is really kind of baseline necessities for capitalism. And the same thing happened, I think, during civil rights. Is you have this system of redlining, which I outline in the book, that starts during the New Deal. The federal government imposed it on these communities, and what that meant is for most of the century, Black men and women couldn't get mortgages in the neighborhoods that they lived in, and so that cements this racial wealth gap, because it's not just the mortgage, it's all the other credit things, as that rely on your family's wealth and income. So your consumer credit, your ability to get a credit card, all of that stuff. And when the civil rights movement starts pushing for that kind of fix this problem, right? How do we do it, either capital or integration? Then that was also halted. And so I think there's a real story here about what it says about capitalism, in that there are these myths that we don't apply. And I think in any if anyone's been doing capitalism, it's been Black communities, because they haven't had any state subsidies ever, right? So
that is so fascinating. And in reading a lot of your work, I was just, it opened my eyes to many things that I really didn't understand. So I got very intrigued, and I kept reading. And one of the things I want to peel back a little bit of this, you said that when slavery got abolished, Black people did not get access to land. Why? What happened? And you talked about they got some savings, but even that was not protected. Tell us a little bit more about what happened.
Yeah, the savings story is it's a fascinating story, but the land issue was Andrew Johnson is the vice president when Lincoln gets assassinated, and comes into office very much like, he says this is a white man's government, right? So he vetoes the Freedmen's Bill, which is the allocation of land, and the motivating aspect of this, and there's a couple great histories of the cotton sort of market at the time. One that I would recommend, if you don't want it, you can get it in my book, but one that I have worked with, a scholar at Harvard, Sven Beckert, wrote The Empire of Cotton. And he really shows in this very meticulous history of the cotton trade market, where the British merchants and the northern industrialists needed cotton prices to be at a certain point. If you look at the oil markets now, you kind of get this, right? You cannot have, OPEC raising the price of oil or limiting the supply of oil, because then the entire U.S. market is beholden to this one source. And the Southern economy, built on slave labor, was the source of cotton for the entire worldwide trade. So this is the merchants in Liverpool, the northern industrialists, and textiles were what made the capitalist world run, right? That's how, there's, Indian silks and other things like that, but really it was cotton that created these modern markets. And so when Haiti, the Haitian Revolution happened and the Haitians took their land, they stopped growing sugar, or sugar output went down, because if you have a plot of land, you're going to grow the cash crop, but you're also going to grow subsistence crops for your family, right? You're going to feed, you're not going to get sucked into one cash crop, because if it goes bad, then you starve. So that's what the Haitians did. And the sugar prices went, skyrocketed, and sugar was not as important. It was important, but not as important as cotton. And so the fear was, if you give them land, and these are the Black former slaves.
Yeah.
If you give the freedmen land, then cotton prices will increase, and the costs of cotton production will be, too much. And these companies in the North and Liverpool would sink. So it wasn't just a Southern. I think we blame the South a lot, and the South certainly has a lot of blame to take, but there was also a demand from the North. And it was the Republicans who kind of halted in the North, right? The Lincoln's party, who said, you know what, like, let's not push this issue, because, keep them free, but essentially re-enslave them back into the same plantation. A lot of freedmen went back to work for the same masters that had overseen them. Yeah. And I think this is the Haitian freedom movement, is like, they didn't want to grow sugar, because that was like, you go from an institution of slavery. Picking cotton is difficult. I mean, I've never done it, but the accounts are, it was a very hard labor, and so they were re-put in, and the savings bank, the thing that you were mentioning about losing the savings, that was like essentially saying, look, the free market will protect you, right? So when Johnson vetoes this land grant bill, he says, look, you'll bargain for fair wages, the capitalism will protect you. Meanwhile, it's not actually capitalism, right? Because the Southern legislature has made it such that Black men and women couldn't do any other trade besides grow cotton, right? You couldn't sell clothes, you couldn't do anything like that, because this was the basis of the economy. And so they created a savings bank to say, okay, well, pull your deposits. This is the right way to buy land. You're going to earn it rather than just have it handed to you. I mean, mind you, this is at the dawn of emancipation. So the fact that they hadn't worked hundreds of years to earn it, right? So you start seeing this stuff, and then these charges of reverse racism starting to come out 10 years after slavery. Like, oh, well, why are we favoring these Black men and women? And the savings bank essentially creates this big pool of capital that enslaved former slaves actually use it for savings accounts. And this white manager, Henry Cook, his brother's Jay Cook, the infamous Wall Street speculator, blows the money on railroad bonds, which were the subprime credit of the day, and it's gone. And Congress doesn't step in. It was supposed to be like a nonprofit bank by nice Northerners to help Black people, and they lost half of their wages. And it was a huge blow for, decades, if not, a century, because And
I just want to mention something, because a lot of people don't understand where mistrust comes from. And, the seeds here are hundreds plus of years old, but they're real. They're generational. They're real. But did you ever wonder what would have happened if Lincoln is not assassinated?
Yes. There's two moments. I think the Lincoln assassination and honestly, Robert Kennedy's assassination. Like, if it hadn't been Nixon, I think those were two huge pivot points. And the fact that they both were, assassinated, there was this real halt. And I don't know if Robert Kennedy would have won, but there's no way Hubert Humphrey was going to beat Nixon, or George Romney on the left. George Romney became a hero of mine on the Republican side, because he was like convinced about racial inequity, and was like, look, as a Republican, I believe in capitalism, and what capitalism requires is that we don't segregate people. And he has this like really radical language during the election, and he got disqualified for this. He said something about Vietnam. He was like, I was brainwashed about Vietnam, which he was right. Like, he was like, I was lied to, and he got disqualified as un-American, and so he dropped out of the race. But really, I wonder what America would have looked like if it was George Romney instead of Nixon, and what the Republican Party would have looked like. Because I think in a way, the Democrats would have stayed Southern Democrats, and the Republicans were the business of progress at the time, or they could have been.
We probably can spend the next 30 minutes. Understand. No, but this is bad, but I think it's important to understand this. And this is what got me fascinated. Let's talk about the New Deal, and let's talk about the similar elements around the FHA program, the GI Bill, and ultimately how in the same or in a similar way, it kind of separated the blacks from, the government supported capitalism, if you may.
Yeah. So this is, to your question, to bring this to this point, just I think I have a sense of history is not inevitable. History, there's a lot of ways that things could have gone differently. And it's not like one person being a villain or being some bad. It's kind of like evolutionary history, like random things happen and then you can accumulate advantages super fast, like humans did in, the evolutionary cycle. But I think like FDR is another pivot point where he needed the Southern Democrats to push his New Deal agenda, which, was, a response to the Great Depression. The business community was against him. But FDR is the one, he's like a hero today to the left, but his administration inscribed segregation into the law. They create these FHA and HOLC maps where they go around the country. And the maps are now available. They weren't when I was writing the book, but I was like looking in archives. And now there's this website called Mapping Inequality by Richmond EDU. It's very easy to find. And you can look at the red line maps in literally any city in the country. And you look at a place like Atlanta, for example, that has, the nice Black neighborhood, like where Morehouse and Spelman and Atlanta University were, single family homes, which was the top rank. And yet they were redlined because they were Black. And so you go around the country and you see this, and they're very explicit, like this is a Black neighborhood and it's therefore redlined, and this is a racially inharmonious, that means it's an integrated neighborhood, or there are subversive races, and it was not just black families, but also Asians or Mexicans or just like poor Jewish people. So lots of anti-Semitism going on. FDR alone, just the anti-Semitism of the FDR administration is just, appalling. Right. So there was a lot of those decisions made, and those maps became the credit system, not just mortgage credit, but also commercial credit for a century, because it's not just that you get this FHA mortgage, it's also that you're building the American suburb, and the roads then come bifurcating the Black redlined areas. You start putting pollutants in those redlined areas. The jobs go where the white families are, and then local taxes fund the schools, right? So the schools become much more, ladders of mobility in the white neighborhoods, and in the Black redline ghettos. Essentially, the jobs are gone. The infrastructure of sort of like subways and stuff isn't, the upkeep isn't good, and then the schools, and then you start layering on top of that the war on drugs and the policing. And so it really, you can really draw every bad, like racist disparity right now to those segregation maps. And those red line maps match up today to where people live. So if you look at like George Floyd, where he was killed, wasn't formerly redline areas. And it's a banking desert, it's a food desert, and the schools are underfunded. It's across the board. It's similar. And so I think it's like one of the original sins of
Well, no, that's how I found the pattern here. Can you talk about the GI Bill the same? Because I think, again, from an education standpoint, it really excluded, underrepresented minorities, and no one talks about this.
Yes, exactly. You have people coming coming back from the war and getting GI Bills for college, and it becomes, like pre-college, you go to like a good school and you pay nothing, $1,000, you can work your way through college. And Black men who also come back from the war are can get GI Bills, but aren't given them, and also can't go to schools aren't integrated, right? So the University of Georgia didn't integrate until like the late 70s. And what they're doing is sending, you can go to an HBCU, but there's only so many spots and you can't get the GI Bill. So in that, there's this bifurcation of opportunities as well. So you don't have that home building equity that provides a buffer to all sorts of things. And you don't have that job that in the post-war economy is essentially like some military contract, I live in Orange County, California. This whole place was built up by military contracts, GE contracts, NASA contracts, like all government contracts. in a certain time. And it also is a place that believes in like hardcore capitalism. Like they think that they've earned, and it's like, I don't doubt anyone's hard work, but if you look at the history of Orange County, it's white flight, and I think this just, to go back to this idea of this middle class being created, you had these men coming back from the war. So the Irish and the Italians, and I want to put the anti-Semitism aside, because I think that's a whole different vein of, but the exclusions and the discriminations against Irish and Italians specifically, and Black families were not quite similar, but there were signs that said no Irish, no Italian, no Black, right? And when they come back from the war, it's like everyone's the same income level and class level in some city, right? And they're paying $50 in rent in New York City in a tenement. It's got rats and it's overcrowded, and they have this, mill job or whatever. And after the New Deal, after 1934, you can get a house for $35 a month in Levittown, all white. And that house is building equity, and you're still making the same wages, but it's just going further and building equity. So it's not as though it gave loans to middle-class Americans. It created middle-class Americans through the loan, and it left out Black families from that middle class purposefully. And Irish and Italians were included. And the fact that we used to discriminate so heavily against the Irish is kind of like a historical, it's like, that's fascinating, that why wouldn't the Irish be white? Well, they weren't, until they were. Yeah.
I wanted to get into this a little later, but, your book, you talk around the fact that at some point here, and it was that the Blacks got left behind, even from others got discriminated against. And there's a story, the original Bank of America was the Bank of Italy, or part of it comes out of the Bank of Italy. And it was a response towards not getting banked by kind of the white banks. I thought that was completely fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Bank of Italy starts in San Francisco, the same way that any Black-owned bank or any Jewish-owned bank or any German-owned bank started, is because you can't get banking services at like white banks. And so they started to serve Italian Americans. And then once that FHA loan comes, the Bank of Italy is able to make a ton of money because the FHA, essentially, you're finance people, right? It takes the risk out of lending because it guarantees the mortgage, right? There was also an FHA consumer loan program that the Bank of Italy and other banks also get to. So it's like you're giving revolving credit with a secondary market guarantee on that credit. And that doesn't last a long time because it really, like, the market takes over there. Right. So there's a robust secondary market for these revolving credit lines. And so the Bank of Italy gains from these programs, makes a ton of money, then branches into California, becomes a Bank of California, and then becomes Bank of America through mergers. And this happens in the 80s as banks merge and become these mega banks. So it does kind of correlate into the certain groups, assimilating.
Hugh McCall had a lot to do with the creation of Bank of America, and that was, Nations Bank coming out of the Southeast, out of Charlotte, indeed, but merging with Bank of America to form Bank of America. But all right, we got to pivot. We can literally spend the whole time talking about the history here. We talk a lot about access to good credit is fundamental to creating kind of real wealth. And what we see is how the government helped a lot of the white communities through good credit programs build that kind of wealth and that momentum that you talk about that then becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Tell us a little bit what you mean about what is good credit and bad credit, because there's a lot of bad credit programs out there that unfortunately a lot of the Black community has been pushed towards.
Yes, exactly. And so where the good credit was not available in these areas, the sort of contract sales or installment lenders came in. And part of it was that they weren't bad lenders. They were just filling a market void with very high risk credit. Because if you're getting, the contract lenders, like, arguably they were bad, right? So they were selling homes to people ostensibly as a mortgage, but it wasn't a mortgage. It was just a fancy rental agreement. And so if you missed one payment, you lost it without any legal process. And so that was really gutting for a lot of people in the community. So the distrust of these financial institutions doesn't even have to go back to the Freedmen's Bank. You can go to any era and look at an exploitative lender. And so the early roots of the civil rights movement actually up north were boycotts of these installment lenders, where you would go and you would buy, a couch and a refrigerator, and they would bundle it up into this contract where the way that the contract was formed is that you could pay the entire principal and all the interest. And if you missed one payment, it was looked as a default across all of the items that you would ever purchased at the store, so that you would get the whole thing. The repo men would come and you'd get everything, right? And so initially these groups, these like mothers groups or whatever in Harlem or Detroit, met up with these lawyers, and these lawyers really like creatively went to court and said, because the lenders were saying this is a contract, like there's no, like you signed this contract and this part of the bundling was in there. And so they started arguing against these contracts and lobbying legislatures to say you can't include these things in contracts. And they had some early wins. And this store sues this group for boycotting them. They're like, you can't boycott a store. Like we have constitutional rights. And the court is like, well, sure they can. They're expressing like this freedom to boycott. And that was in 1940. And Martin Luther King essentially adopts the model of a boycott. So the Montgomery bus boycott, that whole agenda for Martin Luther King was also, look, we will put boycotts, economic boycotts, onto these institutions that are discriminating, and in the South, it was segregation, obviously, on the buses and all of that, which we've heard about. But in the North, it was this credit thing that they were really pushing on. And so that was a big issue in like the post civil rights era. There was riots that erupted in these northern neighborhoods. And a lot of it, like once they started investigating the riots, it wasn't just random violence. It was going into these lenders and like taking the books, like not even taking the stuff, just burning the books. Wow. Where the lenders were. And so, Congress met on it, the Senate, and that was the big issue. And I think that's where somewhat misguided legislation like the CRA kind of responds to. I'm a fan of the CRA, but also it was really meant for a different time. And it didn't recognize that we were already, by the time the CRA was passed, Bank of America was already becoming like a mega bank, and so I don't think it's quite the right or the adequate remedy for the problem.
You, I think it was you, or you were quoting somebody talking about subprime lending and payday loans as the, kind of Jim Crow lending. Tell us what you mean by that, because those are modern day instruments out there that take advantage of the same population. Exactly.
I mean, if you look at what Jim Crow was, it was you have your white institutions and your Black institutions. And then the idea was like, you have your schools and we have our schools. You have your water fountains and we have our water fountains, or train cars or whatever. And that system was legal. And I think, but, it turns out that the schools for the Black, kids weren't as good and they weren't as funded. And so there was, segregation wasn't equal, right? And I think you see this in the credit realm, where you have FHA credit versus a contract sale. FHA credit is 6% mandated, right? That's a cap on how much they can charge for interest. Your deposits are getting 3%. You're paying 6% on a loan. It's kind of like a win for the bank. It's a win for the homeowner whose equity is rising, or a GI Bill. Technically, the GI Bill was a loan, but it was like $1,000 for your education, and the interest was very minimal. Whereas, in the Black community, a contract sale, you're paying, 36% APR, because it's not really, you're using loopholes. You're not getting the house. There's no increase in equity. So that's two different credit systems. And so I think there becomes this sense of like moral, like approbation that we have toward people who take out payday loans or contract, like, oh, it's just bad decisions, or it's like foolish to get into debt, where we kind of ignore the fact that like the middle class built their wealth on credit. So credit is wealth building. If it's good credit, a person can't gain wealth if you don't have credit and don't come from money. So you either can come from money, or you can get a small business loan, a mortgage loan, a loan to fulfill your dreams. That's kind of capitalism. But what if that loan is secretly like 400% interest, and you have to get a payday loan to go to work because you need your car, and so it becomes a a different credit system that doesn't allow for wealth creation.
It's just fascinating. I find this whole topic, I just want to read more and more on it. So thank you for taking all of us there. You also let's talk about this white terrorist acts on blacks. And I found the story of Tulsa in Durham, North Carolina, kind of an interesting contrast on kind of how the people that actually, even black people that were successful and their banks were successful, ended up being targeted. And in many ways, you talk about a doctor in Chicago, and I think that's a really interesting human context here.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is important. I mean, I think those of us who, I come from a war refugee, and I don't know if, unless you've had threats of violence, I think it's hard to understand. And many people who have lived in other places, I think there's a privilege to going through life without having like a threat of violence against you, and I have that now. My children have it, and I feel like, it's such a luxury to have it. And I think a lot of Black families didn't ever have it, and I think it connects to some of the sort of, Black Lives Matter marches over the summer. But you look at the legacy of Black business, and there isn't a single business owner, and until quite recently, and even now, but especially during that era, whose business concerns weren't just terrorism, right? That the white mob would come and take your store if you did too well. And so the Durham-Tulsa contrast was there's several Black Wall Streets around the country, and Tulsa was one, and Durham was one. And Durham, the leaders in Durham were like very cognizant of sort of white resentments building. And so they made their buildings very small. They put them on the outskirts of town. They didn't do showy, like nice buildings. And also Durham had sort of broad, everyone was doing okay because it was tobacco and some textiles. And so there was, and they were able to survive that sort of heat of racial terrorism. Tulsa was the opposite, right? There was an oil boom, and the Black community did very well. And they had this Black Wall Street in the middle of town. They built a beautiful church, and it was Greenwood Avenue. There was just like a very wealthy Black community. And then the oil slump happened, and the white resentment grew. And, every issue, there was like one issue where maybe a Black teenager had looked at a girl in an elevator. And anyway, they put him in prison at night, and the Black men were NAACP members, and they were armed. Everyone in Tulsa was armed. And so the Black men came to protect this boy from what always happened. They didn't want a lynch mob. And so at that night, they were protecting him, and then a shot rang out, and then the white community essentially burned Black Wall Street. And overnight, and thousands of people were displaced. And now we know, I gotta say, when I was writing this book, there was these accounts. I was looking at the firsthand accounts of like aerial bombs coming, and I'm like, that cannot be. And now they've released the documents slowly, but there were bombs, and they bombed out, and these people were essentially refugees for the rest of their lives, and couldn't talk about, like, the people that remained didn't talk about the Tulsa. Now we're calling it a massacre, but there they called it like an event, for hundreds of years. And I think that kind of that happened in a couple places. Wilmington, Delaware, Georgia. There were several sundown towns where the white community essentially ejected all of the Black residents from a town at the threat of violence, and took property, right? So Black property owners were constantly in threat of their properties being just taken by mob. And this doctor one that you talk about, this is in Chicago, where many Black families, if they were the first families to move into a block, they would face a mob. They would pay extra for the house, and they would have bombs or mobs. And this doctor came to, and he bought a house, and this mob came, and they started throwing like fire bombs into his house with his kids. And so he shot out into the crowd, and someone died, and he was charged with murder. And so Clarence Darrow comes and defends him, and he gets off with murder. It's this big event, but like, unstated is the fact that this was the property owner, like, this was the cost you had to pay to own property in the North. That's Chicago. So I think I read one memoir that kind of clicked this into play. I think it was an early memoir of maybe Ta-Nehisi Coates or someone, not the famous book, but the other one, where he talks about walking to school every day with the threat of like police violence and being jumped, and it just like kind of like jarred me into thinking, what would that like? Imagine your psychological state as like a smart kid who is like wanting to go to school and learn and having to fear bodily injury. And it really kind of, it brings it home, I think, a little bit more than otherwise would. And I think the Black Lives Matter marches were in a way just like a sickness of it. And for all around, there were so many people, it wasn't just the Black community being like, we just don't want to live in this society anymore. So.
It is, it's hard to listen to this, to be honest. It's hard to and I think I don't think this country will ever be able to move forward in any way if we don't acknowledge the past and in many ways the present. And
yes.
if we don't really, you and I talked when we talked the other day about the kind of the missed opportunity by Obama, and maybe his belief that racism was, more a thing of the past, but all these facts are still very systemic. And, like you said earlier, we blame the individual, we blame, kind of the group, but in reality, there's no chance. So.
Yeah. I mean, James Madison called slavery America's original sin. And I think the problem is that we've just never confronted it. We didn't do it at the Civil War. We didn't do it in the Civil Rights Movement. It's like, okay, we're going to stop that bad thing, but we're not going to talk about the mythologies that justified it. And I think you're exactly right. Until we kind of like have truth and reconciliation, we can't move on. It's still the stain. And you're seeing already this backlash of like, why? I'm just sick of talking about racism. We're just like, we haven't really done it. We haven't done it, and so reading this book, like, I'm not Black. I have no claim to this history, but reading it as a person who is an immigrant, who can adopt this model minority myth, like, it's given to me. I can easily say, well, look at us, like we succeed, these Middle Eastern immigrants, and so you just have to work harder. But like reading this history, I was like, that's bullshit. Like, and it's like, and I think the injustice of it, like, it made me irate writing this book, but I can't imagine what it's like to live it, because it's not personal to me. And I could say that no one in my ancestry was Black and had to deal with this. And I just imagine that you'd get like sick of trying to explain stuff, after a while. And so people are like, well, why did you write the book? I'm like, I couldn't not write the book after seeing it, because it was going to be an immigrant book. It was going to be more about the other people. And I was like, the story isn't there. The story is in these banks.
And to be clear, you wrote this book before George Floyd. So this was, were like, this is an important observation, is that you saw this and you're like, I can't believe this is not.
I wrote this book before Trump. No, I mean, this book was finished before the Trump, so I had to revise.
You had to revise a bit of it, right?
I was like very critical of Obama at the end, and I'm like, oh, I better like. So the last chapter, I had to be like, just tamp down the anti-Obama criticism. Not that I was a fan of Obama, but I was like, oh, it's way worse than I had expected.
Well, let's actually get a little more positive here, and I think there's a couple of topics that that I found interesting reading about. Is one of this. I know you're in support of the. Why not turn the postal banking system into some way of providing financial access to the banking deserts out there? I think it's like 59% of the post offices are in areas where there's no banks. And there's 63 million unbanked Americans, mostly in those, banking deserts. And, I would love, I know there's some light experiments going on. How seriously is the government taking this? How bullish are you on this?
Yeah, so I mean, Trump's inspector general he's still there, did a pilot on postal banking. And postal banking, it was a solution from in my last book. This book I ended with like, look, we just need to wide scale reform. The last book, I felt like it was this idea of like, look, when Bank of America, going back to Bank of America, Hugh McCall said, you're either growing or you're dying, right? And so you either grew or you died. And a lot of rural communities, a lot of poor communities lost their bank because it's not profitable. And so now you have fintech firms that are filling this gap and doing it, sometimes quite well, sometimes not as well. But even like PPP loans, fintech firms were able to get loans to smaller businesses better because they, have fewer just legacy customers. So there is a way that you're equalizing, but for a lot of the rural communities, there isn't that point of like cash to digital, right?
Right.
We need broadband, they need broadband, and they need Native American reservations. So this is like an acute problem that isn't getting better. And it's not a problem that banks are interested in fixing, or should they fix, because it's more infrastructure problem. So the idea here is just, look, you could go cash your checks at the post office and get this digital account, which then you could, add any, you just participate in commerce. You can buy online, you can do whatever you want. And I mean, this was something that we did historically in America. A lot of other countries, do it. The Post is the #1 bank for poor people worldwide, so it makes sense. I think there was some immediately, in America, and I wrote about the history in the first book, it was a Republican idea, but it got adopted this time around by some Democrats. And so it became kind of partisan, but right now we do have so it was started by an Republican and ended by a Democrat, postal banking, and it got partisan, as everything does.
Shocker.
Yes. Yeah. But I think they are interested. I think increasingly people are starting to see that this is not a political solution. You don't have to adopt a version of banking. You just have to give people banking services.
With all the bad rep, rightly so, that a lot of the tech firms are getting right now around how they're not policing the impact of their own technology. I think fintechs could, with the support of the government, could really make a leapfrog advance here. And I think it's something that, again, I'm not hearing a lot about, and I have some friends in the space that I'm going to nudge and push just to see if they're even thinking about it. One other thought, again, in the more future looking, clearly, America is getting reurbanized, and people are coming out of the suburbs, and part is COVID, part was already started. And that you can see it. You can even see it in Charlotte and other cities that we're in, like the gentrification of areas and the pushing out of the poor communities. You talk a lot about the opportunity, maybe as a way to revitalize those areas versus gentrify those areres. Tell me more about that, and what do you think can happen at the local government level to do that?
Yeah. So I think I came up with a white paper on this called the 21st Century Homestead Act. Borrowing things that worked before, but you have areas like Detroit or Baltimore, parts of Philadelphia, where there's blight. There's some areas right now where you can't afford a house. San Francisco, New York, LA, where it's just a seller's market. You've got bidding wars, all sorts of stuff. But you still have regions in America that the housing market's essentially broken. Detroit, you're buying homes for $4,000 because nobody will, private equity firms come in and buy them because you can't get financing, because there's blight around it. The development, the sort of upkeep is more than, the overpaid, the taxes that are unpaid are more than, the cost of the house. And so in those areas, I think one innovative thing that localities and regions can do is sort of land bank those homes and revitalize together with public money. And New York City did this in Harlem and in Queens, is buy up a bunch of houses in tax arrears and redevelop them. You can use private developers and then grant or sell at below market to the residents of those areas. Now, New York didn't do it to the residents, so it helped push gentrification, but it made a ton of money off of these sales because they bought, essentially they just kind of waived the taxation and then they redeveloped. And if you do it holistically in an area, you don't have the problems of having to get bank financing. And so there's some things that, you need coordination for. You need some sort of because you can't rely on a private underwriter if you're saying, well, finance is one individual house. Like Baltimore did this. They tried to give houses away for $1, but no bank would finance the upkeep, right? You need $100,000 to make it livable, and no one's going to give you $100,000 on a $1 equity investment, right? So this is to remedy that.
You
And
know,
I think there's a lot of potential.
we in Puerto Rico after the Hurricane Maria, we started this this project called Rebuild Puerto Rico, and what we ended up doing was buying projects that had been abandoned before finished, and went and bought the project, finished it, and then took $100,000 loan and sold it to people that had jobs for basically $20,000, but they need to pay their $20,000 to get the balance forgiven, right? So
That's
they have
exactly what I'm. That's
payment.
exactly
Yeah.
it.
So we have 100 homes in Puerto Rico today that we're doing this in a very micro level, but something that the team in Puerto Rico has done an amazing job.
That's fantastic.
Kind of, just an experiment on it. Listen, I know we're running out of time. I read your article on private equity and I found that fascinating. So maybe a topic for another discussion. And there's 17 other things I would love to learn. So I look forward to continuing this dialogue. But you also stated something that stayed with me, which is, poor families, I guess, spend close to 10% of what they make on transaction fees. Let me just repeat that. 10% of what they make on transaction fees to access the banking system in one way or another. When rich families, we pay close to zero, right? Because of they're using our money. That just seems wrong in so many levels, in so many ways. If you were in the administration today, and you had the power, what would you do to at least level that playing field?
Yeah, I mean, this is a role for opening up the payment system, whether it's through postal banking or through a fintech app or whatever. I mean, we give banks a monopoly on payments right now, and there's no need to, right? So you have to have people being able to send financial transactions without paying a fee. So the unbanked right now, I mean, how can you do it? If you don't have a bank account, you have to go through a check casher, to send remittances, Western Union. It's like an old legacy system, and the technology is there. We have technology to clear a check with a photo, and that technology is only, able to be used by banks, but that's a policy decision. And I think the tech is there already, and we just need to open it up. So there's a lot of policy decisions, and on the private equity, there's like as many good equity for and sometimes I feel like, look, our only choice is with the market. Like it's only shareholders and equity holders that are doing these like long-term decisions, on climate, on race, right? And so sometimes it is, you look, if there's a solution here and the government is too broken to do it. But I guess I still, despite the bad kind of topics that I write about, I'm still an optimist that we can coordinate.
I have to stay optimistic. Professor Baradaran, I have loved this conversation. I've learned a lot. I admire your work. Thank you for the inspiration. I have great respect for our team that is just putting, our platform out there. I think there's so much more that we could and will do and should and will do as a company, and inspired by your work. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor. It was a pleasure.